Isabella Whitmore had always prided herself on treating her driver as nothing more than a professional service till she caught herself staring at Damon. Cross's hands wrapped around the steering wheel of her Mercedes and realized she was in serious trouble. The morning commute that had once been her sanctuary for reviewing quarterly reports had transformed into 45 minutes of exquisite torture. Watching those strong fingers navigate Manhattan traffic with the same confident precision she imagined they'd use to navigate her body. The leather seat beneath her Hermes dress felt suddenly warm as she shifted in the back of the sedan. Hyper-aware of how the silk had ridden up her thighs during the ride from her penthouse to Whitmore Holdings. Through the privacy partition, she could see Damon's shoulders moving beneath his perfectly pressed uniform, the fabric stretching across muscles that spoke of strength earned rather than purchased at exclusive fitness clubs. Traffic's heavy. This morning, Ms. Whitmore, his voice came through the intercom, that slight rasp making her pulse quicken against her throat. Should I take the alternate route? Whatever you think best, she managed, proud that her voice carried no trace of the heat pooling low in her belly. 3 months he'd been driving her. 3 months of professional distance that was crumbling like expensive foundation under pressure she hadn't anticipated. Their eyes met in the rearview mirror for just a moment, long enough for electricity to arc between them before Damon returned his attention to the road with deliberate professionalism that somehow felt more intimate than a lingering stare. Isabella's breath caught as she realized he was fighting the same awareness, the same inappropriate hunger that violated every unspoken rule about employers and employees. She crossed her legs slowly, deliberately, watching his eyes flick to the movement in the mirror before he adjusted his grip on the steering wheel with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The air in the back seat felt thick with possibility and restraint. Professional boundaries stretched taut as piano wire between them. Ms. Whitmore. Damon's voice carried a question she wasn't ready to answer, his dark eyes finding hers again. In the reflective glass that both connected and separated them. Yes. The word escaped as barely more than a whisper. We've arrived at your office. Isabella looked up to find the familiar glass towers of the financial district surrounding them. Reality crashing back like ice water. But as Damon moved to open her door, she caught the way his gaze lingered on her legs. And she knew that whatever was building between them was far from over. The game had just begun. The board meeting had run 3 hours past schedule, and Isabella found herself sliding into the back seat of her Mercedes well after 9 o'clock, exhaustion weighing heavier than the diamond necklace at her throat. City lights blurred past the tinted windows as Damon navigated through sparse evening traffic, the familiar hum of the engine creating an intimacy that daylight commutes never allowed. Long day. His voice came softer through the intercom, lacking the formal distance he usually maintained. The partition between them felt less like a barrier and more like a confessional screen in the dim interior. Endless, Isabella admitted, letting her head fall back against the leather headrest. Sometimes I think these men speak in circles just to hear themselves talk. She caught Damon's quiet chuckle in the rearview mirror, his eyes crinkling with genuine amusement rather than polite acknowledgement. My sister says the same thing about her corporate job. Claims half her meetings could be solved with a 2-sentence email. The casual mention of his personal life surprised her, cracking open assumptions she'd carried for months. Your sister works in corporate, systems analyst at Goldman Sachs, he said, taking the longer route without being asked. Has her MBA from Wharton. Always teases me about being the family disappointment who chose cars over computers. Isabella felt something shift in her chest, preconceptions crumbling like expensive china under unexpected pressure. Why did you choose this? Damon was quiet for a moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice dropped to something almost confessional. I like the freedom. No boardrooms, no politics. Just the road, and whoever trusts me to get them where they need to go safely." Their eyes met in the mirror again, but this time neither looked away immediately. "And do you?" she whispered. "Get them where they need to go." "Depends where they really want to end up," he replied, his voice carrying implications that had nothing to do with destinations. Isabella's pulse quickened as she leaned forward slightly, drawn by the intimacy of darkness and honest conversation. What if they don't know where that is? Then maybe they need someone to help them figure it out. The car slowed to a stop at a red light, and in the sudden stillness, Isabella reached toward the partition controls. Her fingers brushed against Damon's as he moved to lower the divider. The brief contact, sending electricity shooting up her arm like expensive champagne hitting empty stomach. "Ms. Whitmore," he said quietly, her formal title sounding almost like an endearment in the charged air between them. "Isabella," she corrected, her voice barely audible over the sound of her racing heart. When the light turned green, neither of them moved to restore the barrier. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally broke as Isabella emerged from the Metropolitan Museum's charity gala. Rain lashing against her emerald silk gown with nature's complete disregard. $4,000 designer fabric. Damon appeared instantly with an umbrella, his hand finding the small of her back to guide her toward the Mercedes. The brief contact sending heat through her rain-chilled skin. "Terrible night to be caught without proper coverage," he said, helping her into the back seat where she sat shivering in sodden silk that clung to every curve like liquid temptation. Thunder crashed overhead as they pulled away from the museum, rain drumming against the roof with primal intensity that matched the electricity building between them. Isabella watched water stream down the windows, the city lights blurring into abstract art while her dress grew increasingly uncomfortable against heated skin. "The air conditioning," she said, her voice carrying a breathlessness that had nothing to do with the weather. "Could you turn it off? I'm freezing." Damon's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror, dark with concern that quickly shifted to something more dangerous when he saw how the wet fabric outlined her body. "Of course, would you like me to raise the temperature?" Instead of answering, Isabella made a decision that would have horrified her board of directors. She opened the partition and slipped through into the front seat, her movements fluid despite the restricting dress. "I hope you don't mind the company." The confined space transformed their dynamic completely, professional distance evaporating like rain on hot pavement. Isabella's thigh pressed against the gear shift as she settled beside him, hyper-aware of his sharp intake of breath when her wet dress rode higher up her legs. "Isabella," Damon said quietly, her name carrying warning and desire in equal measure. "This isn't what?" She interrupted, turning toward him so their faces were inches apart, breathing the same charged air while lightning illuminated the hunger in his dark eyes. "Isn't proper, isn't safe." Her hand found his thigh, feeling muscle tense beneath expensive fabric as another crash of thunder masked his sharp exhale. The storm outside seemed to echo the electricity crackling between them. Nature providing soundtrack to the moment they both stopped pretending this was just employer and employee sharing space. "Neither of those things," he managed, his voice rough with restraint that was clearly costing him everything. "But maybe that's exactly what makes it necessary." When he reached up to brush a strand of wet hair from her face, Isabella leaned into the touch, her lips parting slightly as his thumb traced her cheekbone with reverent precision. The next flash of lightning revealed them, frozen in that moment, poised on the edge of crossing a line they could never uncross. The Whitmore family estate felt like a mausoleum dedicated to old money and older expectations. All marble columns and ancestral portraits where Isabella sat trapped in the mahogany-paneled boardroom that had witnessed 3 generations of calculated marriages. Her father, Richard, commanded the head of the table with silver-haired authority, while her sister, Charlotte, perched beside him like a perfectly groomed accomplice. both radiating the particular satisfaction of those about to close a profitable deal. "The Pemberton merger represents everything we've worked toward," Richard announced, sliding a photograph across polished wood with the efficiency of someone accustomed to trading human lives like stock options. "James Pemberton III is Harvard-educated, comes from impeccable bloodlines, and his family's shipping fortune complements our portfolio beautifully." Isabella stared at the image of a bland, privileged face that could have been stamped from the same cookie. Cut her as every other suitable heir she'd been expected to consider. Her phone buzzed against her thigh, and she fought the urge to check. What she hoped was Damon's text about their evening plans. "He's perfect for you, Izzy," Charlotte added with sisterly authority that felt more like a noose tightening around Isabella's throat. "The families have been friends for decades. It's practically destiny." "Destiny," Isabella repeated, the word tasting like expensive wine gone sour. Her mind flashed to rain-slicked windows and the feeling of Damon's thumb tracing her cheekbone with reverent precision touch that had nothing to do with business arrangements and everything to do with authentic connection. "The wedding could be next spring," Richard continued, already planning her future with the same ruthless efficiency he applied to hostile takeovers. "A merger of this magnitude requires proper presentation. The society pages will showcase American aristocracy at its finest." Isabella's hands clenched in her lap as another text buzzed against her leg. Damon's presence a lifeline in the suffocating atmosphere of predetermined choices. She imagined his hands on the steering wheel, strong and honest, compared to the manicured softness of men who'd never worked for anything beyond maintaining inherited privilege. "What if I refuse?" The words escaped before her executive training could stop them, hanging in the air like expensive crystal waiting to shatter. Richard's smile turned glacial with a particular coldness reserved for family members who threatened carefully laid plans. "Then you'd be choosing to forfeit your inheritance, your position in this family, and your future security. Some choices have consequences that extend far beyond individual selfishness, Isabella." The ultimatum settled around her like expensive silk that had become a shroud, while her phone continued buzzing with messages from the only person who saw her as something more than a profitable asset. Outside, thunder rumbled with promise of another storm. The overlook above the Hudson River felt like the edge of the world. Manhattan's glittering skyline spread below them, while Isabella sat in the passenger seat of the parked Mercedes, her heart hammering against silk that suddenly felt too restrictive. Damon had driven here without being asked, both understanding they needed somewhere private to confront what had been building between them since that first charged glance in the rearview mirror. "Your family's planning your entire future," Damon said quietly, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled restraint. "And I'm just the driver who's about to ruin everything you've been raised to protect. Maybe I don't want to protect it anymore," Isabella whispered, turning toward him with desperate honesty that stripped away weeks of careful pretense. "Maybe I want something real for once in my life." When their eyes met in the dim interior, the last of their professional boundaries crumbled like expensive foundation under pressure neither could resist. Damon reached for her face with trembling fingers, his thumb tracing her lower lip with reverent precision that made her breath catch. "Isabella," he murmured, her name becoming prayer and warning as she leaned into his touch. Once we cross this line, she silenced him with her mouth, claiming his lips with desperate hunger that had been building for months. The kiss exploded between them like lightning finding ground, weeks of restraint transforming into primal need that made rational thought impossible. Without breaking contact, Isabella climbed over the center console with fluid grace that surprised them both, settling onto his lap with silk dress riding up her thighs. Damon's hands found her waist with possessive certainty, pulling her closer as she straddled him in the driver's seat. both breathing hard while the city lights blurred into abstract art beyond steaming windows. "God, you're beautiful," he breathed. Against her throat, his mouth finding sensitive places that made her arch against him with abandon. His hands explored beneath silk with reverent skill, mapping territory that belonged to him now completely and without reservation. Isabella's fingers worked the buttons of his shirt with desperate efficiency, needing to feel skin against skin to claim him as thoroughly as he was claiming her. When she moved against him with deliberate intention, Damon's sharp intake of breath fogged the windows further, creating their own private world suspended above the city. "Please," she whispered, the word escaping as barely controlled desperation. While her body demanded what propriety had denied for too long, their coupling was fierce and urgent, marking each other with possession that transcended social boundaries and family expectations. As Isabella rode him with abandoned grace, both understood they'd just crossed into territory where retreat was no longer possible. The windows completely fogged now, concealing their transformation from employer and employee into something infinitely more dangerous. Damon's Brooklyn apartment felt like stepping into an alternate universe where authenticity replaced artifice. All exposed brick and honest furniture that had been earned rather than inherited. Isabella stood in his modest living room feeling overdressed in designer silk, hyper-aware that her jewelry probably cost more than his monthly rent, yet somehow more at home than she'd ever felt in her marble penthouse. "It's not much, Damon," said quietly, his vulnerability unexpected from someone who'd commanded her attention so completely in the car. Family photographs lined simple shelves, showing genuine smiles that had nothing to do with social obligations or profitable connections. "It's real," Isabella replied, moving toward him with desperate honesty that made his breath catch. "Everything in my world is purchased, arranged, designed to impress. This feels like you actually live here." When he pulled her against his chest, the kiss that followed carried different energy than their desperate encounter overlooking the city. Here, surrounded by his authentic life, their passion transformed into something deeper. Reverent worship that acknowledged they were crossing from physical attraction into dangerous, emotional territory. His bedroom was spartanly furnished, but immaculately clean. Moonlight streaming through simple curtains as he undressed, her with trembling hands that treated her silk dress like precious artifact. When Isabella lay back on his modest bed, the contrast between threadbare sheets and her diamond necklace created poetry that expensive hotel suites could never match. "You're so beautiful," Damon whispered, his mouth tracing paths across skin that had never been worshipped with such reverent attention. Isabella arched beneath his touch, surrendering completely to hands that knew how to coax responses her privileged lovers had never discovered. Their lovemaking was slow and thorough, each position a new verse in their developing song of possession and surrender. When Isabella rode him with abandoned grace, then later submitted to his patient worship, both understood they were marking each other in ways that transcended physical claiming. Dawn found them tangled in sheets that smelled like honest labor and satisfied desire. Isabella's manicured fingers tracing patterns on Damon's chest while he played with her disheveled hair. The intimacy felt more dangerous than their passionate encounters this quiet. Domesticity threatened everything she'd been raised to value. "Maya's coming by for breakfast," Damon said softly, his sister's impending visit creating the first intrusion of real-world complications. "She'll have questions about why there's a Mercedes parked outside." Isabella felt her stomach tighten with recognition that this beautiful interlude was about to collide with consequences neither could control. Through his window, her expensive car looked like evidence of transgression that couldn't be hidden much longer. "What do we tell her?" Isabella whispered, already knowing the answer would force them to define what they'd become. The Meridian Country Club's dining room felt like a tribunal disguised as lunch. all crystal chandeliers and whispered conversations where Isabella's sister Charlotte held court among women who'd built careers from detecting social weakness. Isabella sat at their usual table fighting to maintain composure, while her phone buzzed with texts from Damon that made her pulse quicken with memories of his hands, mapping her body just hours earlier. "You seem distracted lately," Charlotte observed, with the sharp precision of someone trained to identify profitable vulnerabilities. "Missing important calls, arriving late to board meetings. Father's concerned about your focus on the Pemberton merger." Isabella's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she fought to ignore the faint bruise on her collarbone that makeup couldn't quite conceal. "I've been dealing with contractor issues. The renovation is more complex than anticipated." Speaking of contractors, Margaret Hendricks interjected with calculated sweetness. "I saw your driver leaving rather late last evening. Security in the neighborhood requires such vigilance these days." The coded accusation hit Isabella like ice water, making her realize how easily her carefully constructed world could crumble under scrutiny from women who wielded gossip like surgical instruments. Round the table, other socialites nodded with satisfied authority, their weapons honed by generations of practice in destroying reputations while maintaining perfect manicures. "Professional services often require extended hours," Isabella managed, her executive training reasserting itself even as her body betrayed her with visible flush. "Quality work demands patience." Later, in the Whitmore Holdings conference room, Isabella found herself completely unable to concentrate on quarterly projections, while Richard's disapproving gaze tracked her every movement. Her phone vibrated constantly with messages that made her remember Damon's mouth against her throat, his whispered promises about what he planned to do to her that evening. "Isabella." Richard's voice cut through her haze with paternal authority that carried underlying threat. "The Henderson Group is waiting for your analysis of their investment portfolio." She scrambled for documents that suddenly felt foreign in hands that still carried the scent of Damon's skin, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal the woman underneath who'd discovered desires that threatened everything she'd been raised to protect. "Perhaps you need some time to refocus," Richard continued with surgical precision. "The family physician could prescribe something for stress. Or maybe a vacation would help clear your mind of ... distractions." When Charlotte appeared in the doorway with private investigator business cards barely concealed in her designer handbag, Isabella understood that her family's suspicions had crystallized into action. The walls were closing in with corporate efficiency, and her secret affair was about to become very public evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she was afraid to look. The Whitmore family library felt like a courtroom when Isabella entered to find Richard standing behind his mahogany desk with photographs spread across the leather surface like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. Security footage, telephoto shots of her entering Damon's apartment. Images that reduced their beautiful connection to sordid scandal material designed to destroy rather than understand. "How long has this been going on?" Richard's voice carried the glacial authority of someone accustomed to crushing threats to family reputation with surgical precision. "How long have you been sleeping with the help?" Isabella's blood turned to fire at the calculated dehumanization. Her father's words designed to reduce Damon to a category rather than acknowledging him as the man who'd awakened parts of her soul she'd forgotten existed. "His name is Damon Cross, and he's worth 10 of your country club friends. He's a chauffeur," Richard spat with contempt that revealed the institutional racism underlying his polished veneer. "A servant who's forgotten his place and seduced a naive woman into jeopardizing everything this family has built." The library door opened to reveal Damon himself, summoned like evidence to be examined and dismissed. His dignity in the face of obvious hostility made Isabella's chest tighten with fierce protectiveness. recognizing that he was walking into a trap designed to humiliate rather than understand. "Mr. Cross," Richard continued with poisonous courtesy, "your employment is terminated immediately. Any attempt to contact my daughter will result in legal consequences that will destroy what little future you might have imagined." "With respect, sir," Damon replied quietly, his voice carrying strength that commanded attention despite Richard's attempts at intimidation. "Your daughter is capable of making her own choices." Isabella felt something crystallize in her chest as she watched. Two worlds collide. The authentic man who'd shown her what real connection felt like, and the toxic privilege that had shaped her entire existence. When she stepped closer to Damon, her hand finding his with deliberate defiance, she saw Richard's face flush with rage at her public choosing of sides. "Choose carefully, Isabella," her father warned with surgical coldness. "Some decisions can't be unmade." Without hesitation, she turned toward Damon with desperation that transcended rational thought. "Take me away from here." They escaped too. His Mercedes, with hearts hammering against each other's chests. The confrontation having stripped away pretense to reveal the stakes of their connection. When Damon pulled her into the back seat with urgent hunger. Their lovemaking carried desperation and defiance in equal measure, claiming each other despite threats. Marking territory that belonged to them regardless of consequences. "Whatever happens next," Isabella whispered against his throat as they moved together with fierce intensity. "I choose you." The words felt like revolution wrapped in surrender. The Whitmore Holdings conference room felt like an execution chamber when Isabella arrived to find the entire board assembled around. Mahogany that reflected faces carved from institutional prejudice and calculated cruelty. Richard stood at the head of the table with legal documents spread before him like weapons designed to destroy rather than negotiate, while Charlotte watched with the satisfied expression of someone whose warnings had been vindicated by spectacular failure. "Your final choice, Isabella," Richard announced with surgical precision that cut through any illusion of familial warmth. "Sign the agreement to marry James Pemberton within 6 months, or forfeit your inheritance, your position in this company, and your place in this family permanently." The documents before her represented everything she'd been raised to value: millions in trust funds, executive positions, social standing that opened doors most people never knew existed. Across from her sat men who'd helped build the family empire, their faces revealing exactly what they thought of women who chose passion over profit. "We've arranged for Mr. Cross to receive a substantial settlement in exchange for his discretion," Charlotte added with poisonous sweetness. "Enough to relocate somewhere far from New York and begin a new life without ... complications." Isabella's hands trembled as she realized they'd reduced her authentic connection to a transaction that could be resolved with money, treating Damon like a problem to be solved rather than acknowledging him as the man who'd awakened her capacity for real love. Later, in Damon's modest bedroom, desperation transformed their lovemaking into something fierce and tender simultaneously. Isabella clung to him with desperate hunger, her body memorizing every touch while her mind raced with the impossibility of their situation. When he moved inside her with reverent precision, she tasted salt on her lips and realized she was crying. "Hey," Damon whispered against her temple, his movements gentle despite the urgency building between them. "We'll figure this out." "They want to buy you off?" Isabella gasped, her words broken by pleasure and panic in equal measure. "Send you away like you're nothing?" Maya's quiet knock interrupted their desperate intimacy, her voice carrying concern that penetrated their private world. "Damon, there are men outside asking questions about Isabella. Expensive suits, government badges." The investigation had escalated beyond family pressure into something official and threatening, making Isabella understand that choosing love meant facing consequences far more complex than losing money. as she held Damon's face between trembling hands. Both recognized they'd reached the point where every choice carried devastating cost. "Tomorrow, I have to give them an answer," Isabella whispered, her voice carrying weight of transformation that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary. "What will you tell them?" Damon asked quietly. Isabella's kiss tasted like courage mixed with fear. But her answer was clear. The Whitmore Holdings boardroom felt like a cathedral dedicated to corporate power as Isabella entered for what she knew would be her final performance in the role of dutiful heiress. 12 men in expensive suits sat around mahogany that had witnessed 3 generations of calculated decisions. Their faces carved from institutional privilege that viewed her choice as evidence of temporary insanity rather than authentic awakening. Richard stood at the head of the table with marriage contracts spread before him like surrender documents, his silver hair and conservative demeanor radiating the particular authority of someone accustomed to buying compliance through financial leverage. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Isabella could see Damon waiting beside his Mercedes 42 floors below, its patient dignity making her chest tighten with fierce protectiveness. "Have you reconsidered your position?" Richard asked with surgical precision that cut through any illusion of paternal concern. "The Pemberton Alliance represents everything this family has worked to achieve." Isabella looked around the table at faces that had shaped her entire existence, recognizing them now as representatives of a world that valued profit over passion, heritage over happiness. When she stood with trembling hands that somehow felt steady, her voice carried strength that surprised everyone present. "I refuse," she announced clearly, her words echoing off expensive acoustics that had never heard such defiance. "I choose love over legacy, authenticity over arrangement. I choose Damon." The silence that followed felt loaded with shock and calculation as 12 powerful men processed the reality that their carefully constructed merger had just evaporated due to a woman's refusal to be treated like corporate asset. Richard's face flushed with rage that revealed the toxic masculinity underlying his polished veneer. "Then you forfeit everything," he spat with finality that felt like doors slamming shut on everything she'd been raised to protect. "Your inheritance, your position, your family name, all gone for a momentary infatuation with the help." Isabella felt liberation wash over her like expensive champagne as she recognized that losing everything meant gaining herself. Walking toward the elevator with her head held high, she understood that some prices were worth paying for the chance at Quelle's authentic connection. Damon was waiting when she emerged onto the street, his dark eyes searching her face for confirmation of the choice that would reshape both their lives. Without words, she ran toward him with desperate joy, claiming his mouth in a kiss that tasted like freedom earned through courage. "Take me home," she whispered against his lips, her voice carrying triumph rather than defeat. Their celebration in the back seat was fierce and grateful, marking each other with possession that transcended social boundaries and family expectations. When Isabella rode him with abandoned grace, both understood they'd just chosen love over everything else that seemed safer but felt hollow. Revolution had never felt so much like coming home. The one-bedroom apartment above Damon's auto shop felt like freedom distilled into 800 square feet of honest living, where Isabella discovered that happiness could be measured in shared morning coffee rather than quarterly profit margins. 6 months after walking away from Whitmore Holdings, she stood at the kitchen window, watching Damon work on a vintage Mustang below, her body responding to his movements with the same electric awareness that had first awakened her desires. "You're staring again?" Maya teased from the small dining table where she graded papers for her weekend tutoring program. Damon's sister had become the family Isabella never knew she wanted, known as funny, completely unimpressed by her former wealth. "Can you blame me?" Isabella replied. Admiring the way motor oil and honest sweat made Damon more attractive than any boardroom executive she'd ever known. Your brother looks good with his hands on machinery. Their modest apartment told stories of building something real, together second-hand furniture they'd chosen jointly. Photographs of actual memories rather than staged family portraits. Books that had been read for pleasure instead of social currency. When the shop's phone rang with another customer, Isabella felt pride that had nothing to do with inherited achievement. The financial reality of their choice remained challenging. Isabella's trust fund had evaporated with her family connection, leaving her to discover skills beyond managing inherited wealth. She'd found work at a nonprofit focused on urban development, earning less in a year than she'd once spent on jewelry, but experiencing satisfaction that stock portfolios had never provided. The Morrison account cleared. Damon called from below, his voice carrying exhaustion mixed with triumph. 3 months of careful work had finally paid off. Literally and figuratively, Isabella made her way downstairs, where grease and determination created an atmosphere more intoxicating than any country club gathering. When she wrapped her arms around Damon from behind, feeling muscle tense beneath work clothes, heat built between them despite the public setting. Celebrating later, she whispered against his ear, her tongue tracing sensitive places that made his breath catch audibly. "Always," he murmured back, turning in her arms to claim her mouth with kisses that tasted like success earned rather than inherited. Their passion remained as electric as ever, but now it was grounded in partnership, built through shared struggle. When Mrs. Chen from the corner market stopped by with homemade soup, Isabella understood they'd built something more valuable than money, authentic community that accepted them as they were rather than what they represented. "Your mama called?" Maya announced later, holding out a phone message that could change everything. Isabella's hands trembled as she recognized the number she'd thought was lost forever. The Brooklyn Community Garden felt like paradise when Isabella walked down an aisle bordered by wildflowers rather than expensive arrangements, her simple ivory dress flowing behind her as she moved toward Damon waiting beneath an arbor his neighbors had built from reclaimed wood. 25 people who'd become their chosen family watched with genuine joy, faces reflecting love earned through authenticity rather than obligation. Charlotte sat in the front row beside their mother, Kay Eleanor's presence representing forgiveness that had taken 18 months to achieve. Eleanor's designer clothes looked out of place among the honest celebration, but her tears appeared genuine as she watched her daughter choose happiness over heritage. "When I first saw you watching my hands on the steering wheel," Damon said during vows he'd written himself, "I knew you were dangerous to everything I thought I understood about keeping my distance from complicated women." Isabella's laughter mixed with tears as she remembered that first charged glance in the rearview mirror. "When I moved to the front seat," she replied, "I was really moving toward the life I'd always been too afraid to choose." Maya stood as maid of honor, wearing a smile that had welcomed Isabella into family more genuine than inherited wealth had ever provided. When the couple kissed, mechanic friends from Damon's shop cheered with enthusiasm more joyful than any country club reception. Their honeymoon suite felt like sanctuary, dedicated to celebrating transformation complete. When Damon carried her across the threshold with reverent strength, Isabella surrendered to hunger that had evolved from rebellion into authentic claiming of chosen love. "Mrs. Cross," he whispered against her throat as he undressed her with trembling hands, each piece of clothing removed like unwrapping precious gifts. Their wedding dress pooled around her feet while his touch mapped familiar territory with new significance. Their lovemaking was fierce and tender simultaneously, marking each other with possession that transcended social boundaries. When Isabella rode him with abandoned grace, both understood they were celebrating victory over every force that had tried to keep them apart. "Show me what it means to be yours completely," she gasped, her legs wrapping around him as he moved. inside her with practiced precision that felt completely new in the context of marriage. "I choose you," Isabella whispered as waves of pleasure crashed through her. "Every day, for the rest of my life, I choose you over everything else." Dawn found them tangled in sheets that smelled like satisfaction and infinite possibility. When Damon kissed her awake with promises about their honeymoon road trip, Isabella felt excitement about traveling through life as equals. "Ready to drive into our future?" he asked, dark eyes holding promises of unlimited tomorrows. "With you." Isabella smiled, claiming his mouth with kisses that tasted like freedom earned through courage. Always in the front seat. As they loaded their belongings into the car that had witnessed their transformation, Isabella understood that some journeys began with choosing the right person to travel alongside. The road ahead stretched endlessly, and uncertainty felt like promise rather than threat.